What's up everyone? Welcome to a Tidal Gardens Coral Spotlight. If you are new to this channel, Tidal Gardens is a coral farm located in Copley, Ohio, and on this channel, we talk about all things coral reef aquarium related. One of the things that we like to do on this channel is a deep dive into a specific genus of corals, and that is what we're going to do today here with Favia. If you like these coral spotlights, you can join the community by subscribing to this channel. We have many more videos like this planned, so be sure to hit the notification bell to stay up to date on all of our new uploads. Without further ado, let's talk about Favia. Well, sorta. Have you ever got the feeling that the term Favia covered a lot of corals that looked somewhat different? You are not alone. The scientific community agrees with you. Favia brain corals were one of the largest categories of large polyp stony corals in the reef aquarium hobby. At one time, there were nearly 100 species of Favia, but now that number dwindled all the way down to 2. There's Favia fragum and Favia gravida, both of which are Caribbean species. That means that there are essentially 0 Favia brains in the reef aquarium hobby because stony corals from the Caribbean are illegal to collect. So what happened to all these species of Favia? Coral taxonomists over the years reclassified them into other genera as more information was uncovered. Most of the corals that were once classified as Favia are now Dipsastria, Goniastria, Coelastria, or Favites. So given the restructuring, why is this video about quote-unquote Favia? In a way, the term Favia in the reef aquarium industry has turned into a term of art describing a group of basically these closed brain corals similar to chalice corals, the difference being that one is actually a scientific genus and the other one is a common name. Like chalice corals, this collective of these closed brains is ripe for misidentification, especially considering that many of the images online were published with either correct at the time labeling or were misidentified from the start. It makes checking what you have in your tank extremely difficult. So for the rest of this video, we're just going to be calling everything a Favia. This isn't a coral taxonomy channel, it's a coral farming and husbandry channel, and it's more important for us to use the term that the community is searching for when they're looking for help with their particular coral. But for the folks that are interested in taxonomy, I can take a shot at IDing some of the more familiar brain corals. And for me, here's one of those situations where I think that trade names helps from a mental image standpoint. For example, when I think of Dipsastria, I form a mental image of something like a baby's breath, quote-unquote Favia, or a meltdown Favia. Some of the larger polyped corals that were once Favia, things like dragon souls or reverse prisms, I believe are now Coelastria. And the small polyped, really fast-growing guys are still Favites. But a lot of the corals that we had previously lumped in as Favites are actually other things entirely, such as Platygyra. So there has been quite a lot of shuffling, but hopefully you guys get some mental image. Anyway, naming conventions aside, let's now start talking about the husbandry. Let's start first with lighting. When it comes to lighting, Favia corals are not too demanding and can be grown successfully under a wide range of lighting conditions. Favia are photosynthetic, meaning that they get their nutrients from the products of photosynthesis, and that's carried out by symbiotic dinoflagellates called zooxanthellae that are living in their flesh. Zooxanthellae utilize chlorophyll to absorb light and produce simple sugars that the coral can consume for energy. The corals can regulate the amount of zooxanthellae present in their bodies by occasionally expelling excess zooxanthellae, and that looks like kind of like this stream of brown slime coming out of their mouths. This regulation of zooxanthellae can impact the coloration of the coral. In the extreme, total expulsion of zooxanthellae leads to bleaching. We primarily keep Favia in low to medium light intensity here at Tidal Gardens, which is roughly 50 to 100 par. We have kept them in higher lighting, but they did not appear to appreciate it and were always at risk of bleaching out. If you have a colony of Favia and want to experiment with higher light, remember that it can be a risk, so be prepared to move it to a shadier region of the tank at the first signs of trouble. Remember that a coral can live for a really long time in lighting conditions that are too dim, but they're not going to last very long in lighting conditions that are too bright. As for how lighting spectrum affects their coloration, most Favia stay pretty consistent and they're not really likely to change color dramatically with changes in lighting spectrum. You may see a subtle change comparing a specimen grown primarily under daylight versus blue. However, it's not going to completely swap out an entire color palette like some other corals are capable of. Because there are so many corals under this collective Favia umbrella, some may be very fluorescent, which is a joy to look at under full actinic light. Others might have very little fluorescence and look great in daylight, for example this reverse prism celastria. Moving on to feeding. This is probably the most underrated aspect of their care. As we discussed earlier, Favia are photosynthetic and can survive on light alone. There are plenty of hobbyists that make no effort whatsoever to spot feed their corals that are able to keep Favia long term. Having said that, the difference between a Favia that is regularly fed and one that is not is night and day. A fed Favia looks a lot fleshier and the growth rate is greatly accelerated. As far as what to feed and how to feed, what I like to do is lightly feed the tank in advance. This does two things for us. First, it fills up the bellies of fish and inverts, making it less likely that they'll steal food from the corals later. Second, the food in the water activates the coral's feeding response, making it easier to spot feed. Some varieties of Favia can take a few minutes to initiate their feeding response. If you can feed them 3 times per week, a mix of powdered plankton and frozen mysis shrimp, you will see a dramatic increase in size and growth rate. Some are already fast growing, such as Favites. However, there are some notoriously slow growing varieties that their growth rate goes from arguably the slowest growing coral in the industry to something that at least can be farmed with a little bit of patience. Much of what makes these corals slow growers is a lack of food, and when provided with lots of direct feeding, they take off. The reason that I recommend only 3 days a week is to give the corals an opportunity to expel waste when they're done digesting. Sometimes piling food on corals like this goes great at first, but then goes south in a hurry when that food isn't properly expelled, and then that food starts to rot. So, guys, 3 days a week is plenty. Let's talk about flow. There are some that consider water flow more important to coral health than any other parameter. That means more important than lighting, more important than water chemistry. It may be true in some cases, but I think it's less of a factor in Favia health compared to other corals. Favia are tolerant to a wide range of flow patterns, and adjusting flow specifically for Favia may be fruitless. I like to try and provide a very middle-of-the-road, low to medium flow. Too little flow and you run the risk of allowing detritus to settle on the colonies, which can create these dead spots. Too much flow and you run the risk of damaging the coral. You'll know when you've overdone it. If the flow is slamming one side of the coral and it's drawn tight to the skeleton all the time. For feeding purposes, I like to be able to shut off all the flow in the tank for about 20 to 30 minutes to allow the colony to react to the food and consume it. Even just a small amount of flow during spot feeding sessions can waste a lot of food as it blows right over the top of the corals. Let's talk a little bit about placement. The growth forms for Favia can vary from massive dome shapes to encrusting growth forms. It's kind of tough to tell what they're going to be when you're just starting from frags. To place these corals, almost every tank that I see these corals in keeps them towards the bottom of the tank regardless of whether it has a substrate or a bare bottom. They settle in nicely down there. I suppose there isn't a great reason that they couldn't be put on the rockscape, but it is slightly less common. Perhaps the thinking there is that higher up in the aquascape would expose the coral to more light and more flow, which might not be the best combination for this coral. The other thing about placement to consider is how it will spread once it settles into your tank. Like I said before, many of them just grow into a dome-shaped and kind of just do their own thing. Favites, however, it will encrust on the rock. So here's where the genus to genus differences kind of make a difference. Let's talk briefly about water chemistry. Favia brains are stony corals, and as such, they require consistent levels of calcium alkalinity and to a lesser degree magnesium in order to grow their skeleton. People often ask what the levels for specific corals should be, and I always recommend to stick with something close to natural seawater levels with an emphasis on consistency over specific values. I would go as far as to say it's better to keep suboptimal levels of calcium, alkalinity, and magnesium consistent rather than trying to fix low levels overnight with additives. So let's talk about those three things in turn. Calcium is one of the major ions in salt water. In the ocean, level hovers right around 425 parts per million. As a coral grows, calcium is absorbed from the water and used to form its calcium carbonate skeleton. Alkalinity is a collection of ions that generally equate to carbonate availability in the water. The official definition is that it's the amount of acid required to lower the pH of salt water to the point that bicarbonate turns into carbonic acid. If you have more alkalinity, it can soak up more acid. Less alkalinity, and you have less buffering capacity, making the tank more susceptible to chemical changes. In practice, alkalinity tends to be the parameter that fluctuates the most. Like I said, it's a collection of ions. There's a lot going on there. In natural seawater, the alkalinity of the water measures right around 7 or 8 DKH, though most salt mixes these days mix up a little bit higher, closer to 8 or 9 DKH. Some aquarists like to overload this parameter a little and keep their tanks right around 10 or 11 DKH with the rationale that having elevated calcium and alkalinity in the water contributes to faster stony coral growth. Your mileage may vary. If you are experiencing low levels though, say for example low alkalinity, you can add a supplement to boost it, but first double check your test results and the test kit itself to make sure that you're actually experiencing low levels, and then make the change slowly over the course of weeks until you reach a level more in line with natural seawater levels. To maintain consistent levels, the amount of supplementation is going to depend a lot on the size and growth rate of the stony corals in your tank. There are some corals like Celastria that are very slow growing and don't really soak up a ton of those major elements. On the other hand, fast growing corals like the Favites might be more demanding on your reef's chemistry. In practice though, Favia, Favites, Celastria, Goniastria, they are not likely to heavily impact your water chemistry compared to the really fast growing stuff like the SPS. On average, a typical reef aquarium focused mainly on slow-growing LPS might get away with doing water changes to replenish major and minor elements, but it's always a good idea to periodically test to make sure that your levels are not all out of control. If you're having trouble maintaining calcium and alkalinity, keeping an eye on magnesium can help. Raising both calcium and alkalinity together can be tricky because of how they interact. Calcium ions and carbonate want to react with one another. Addition of a calcium supplement often comes with a corresponding fall in alkalinity levels and vice versa. If you're experiencing this in your systems, it's normal by the very nature of these ions, but it's something that you want to try to minimize. If you're experiencing dramatic swings of calcium and alkalinity every time that you use an additive, you may want to look at your magnesium levels. In short, magnesium acts to increase the overall bioavailability of alkalinity compounds in the water, thus providing more chemical stability. In the ocean, magnesium sits at about 1350 parts per million. Calcium and alkalinity aside, stony corals are sometimes more sensitive to declining water quality. In particular, pay attention to elevated nitrate levels. Low nitrate levels around 5 to 10 parts per million are actually welcome for large polyp stony corals, but around 30 to 40 parts per million nitrate and you might start running into some issues. If I see a coral suddenly start receding, my mind immediately goes to possible nitrate issues. To remedy these nitrates, I look to up nutrient removal through more aggressive protein skimming, detritus removal, and more frequent water changes. You can try to limit nutrient input by cutting back on feeding, but I tend to favor heavier feeding and dealing with the possible overages rather than underfeeding because, on average, I think that most aquariums are not getting enough food. One other technique you can try is to pre-rinse your food because a lot of the fines that are in food basically go wasted in the aquarium. So this is also a way to cut into the nutrient load without cutting the direct nutrients to the corals and fish. That's just me though, so it's something that you're going to have to experiment with in your system. And that should give you a little bit of a background on the chemical parameters to keep an eye on. All right, let's talk a little bit about sustainability and aquaculture. The aquaculture prospects for Favia are going to vary on a genus to genus basis. This is one aspect where lumping them all into one category doesn't quite work out so well. Some varieties grow incredibly fast. Other varieties, they are very slow, possibly one of the slowest. That is the major hurdle with long-term aquaculture, the growth rate of these corals. They can be cut pretty easily, and they heal well from cutting pretty much across the board. But some just might not be the best candidates for long-term commercial aquaculture. For hobbyists, sure, go nuts. But to commercially farm the super slow-growing ones, it will either require a major allocation of space or the development of new techniques to enhance their growth rate somehow. Feeding and nutrition is one thing, but more might have to be done. What that is, not entirely sure. And who knows, down the line, perhaps sexual reproduction of these corals might be one of the answers. But right now, a lot of those questions are unanswered. Last little thing I'm going to cover is about pests. Thankfully, pests on Favia are uncommon. You are much more likely to have a bad interaction from a tang or foxface getting too nibbly, or a cleaner shrimp or hermit crab climbing over this coral trying to get to the food. One pest that I have seen before is a flatworm that can show up on a lot of different kinds of large polyp stony corals. They're usually beige in color, and they show up on elegances, scroll coral, pectinia, acanthophilia, and you guessed it, these Favia-type closed brains too. They're not a particularly fast reproducing flatworm, and they don't seem to cause much of any damage. It's not like an Acropora eating flatworm. Those can be very destructive. These are also really easy to dip, which is why I don't get kept up late at night worrying about them. Still, I did want to cover it just in case you happen to see them on one of your other LPS. A quick dip will do the trick. So what kind of tank do I think Favia would look great in? I view Favia as a staple LPS in a mixed reef. There are plenty of absolute showstoppers, and we've shown some of our favorites in this video. But I think their strength aesthetically is that they kind of ground things and let other corals shine. Sometimes when I think there are too many just banger rock star pieces, things in the tank can look really distracting. It's times like this where these support corals, like these brain corals, can really help balance things out and provide a sense of visual depth. They might not be the first thing that people notice in the tank, but rather something that's discovered on a longer viewing. Anyway, what do you guys think? How would you feature a Favia in your tank? All right, guys, that does it for this collective of corals. If you want to see more information on Favia or purchase one for your reef, I invite you to visit us at tidalgardens.com. Until next time, happy reefing.